Access to public documents and meetings is probably one of the most powerful tools that journalists have, and fortunately the access is protected by a variety of laws. So welcome once again to a lecture from Journalism and the Law. I'm Professor Harper, and let's go through some of these elements that you probably know that you have a right to these, but you may not know the legal underpinning for access to documents and meetings. So the Federal Freedom of Information Act, pronounced FOIA, essentially came about in 1966, and it presents a legal burden on the government, that's the federal government, to justify withholding information. It was amended in 1974, 1976 after Watergate, and in 1986 to essentially make it more difficult for government to restrict access to information. So there are some exemptions. You know, most of these make sense. National security, administrative documents, essentially dealing with personnel issues. There are trade secrets, discussions among different departments. This one's intended to say, for example, the Department of Justice is discussing something with the Department of Interior, and information is shared back and forth, and this is designed not to stifle frank exchange, but it can also be a loophole in restricting access to information. So personal privacy, law enforcement records, during an investigation here, so that you can't request access to and records concerning an ongoing investigation that has not been completed. Also, there are exemptions for financial institutions, mainly to do with internal data, and also geological and geophysical information, such as oil wells and also bridges, are restricted under other exemptions. There are law enforcement rulings that deal with FOIA requests. So, for example, the FBI denied FOIA request seeking a rap sheet for Charles Medico. And here the Pennsylvania Crime Commission had identified him and his family as linked to the mob, but he hadn't been convicted of anything. So the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the disclosure of an FBI rap sheet to a third party could essentially be expected to constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. Computer databases have been covered since 1996, so that the Electronic Freedom of Information Act extended the law to computer materials. The government must respond within 10 days for expedited requests, or 20 days for formal requests to this information. And you can see the law under the spj.org, opendoors.asp. Now, what's important to think about when you're doing a Freedom of Information request, or we'll get later to the state requests, is that you need to make sure that you identify as best as possible the information that you're seeking. It's also important to write a letter, and you send it what's called return receipt requested. That proves to you that somebody has gotten the letter. It gives you a specific date so that you can start the clock. I mean, it's our tendency to use email now, and you can use email, but it's very important to file something where there's actually a record of when you filed the request, that someone has received it, and to get that information in writing. The Homeland Security Act essentially has restricted some access to FOIA requests concerning businesses, infrastructure, and information concerning terrorists and supporters. So one other thing that happened is that after 9/11, government websites reduced the amount of available information publicly. Probably a good move. The Pennsylvania Right to Know is essentially the state version of the federal law, and almost every state has some form of procedures to obtain information from the government. 2002 was the latest revision, and it essentially took the amount of time that agencies had to explain in writing while they've denied requests. And you know, it's important to realize that you do have the ability to appeal, and if you win the appeal, the government can be subjected to fines for withholding information. Now, the state of Pennsylvania is not great at responding to right-to-know law requests. Okay, it's important, if you want to go this route, that you have been in touch with either your attorney or your news organization's attorney, that you're willing to go to court to fight for this. And that may be expensive, but if you win, you're generally going to get those fees returned to you. Now, some tips is, I said before, you need to know the laws. They're available online. You need to identify the person that is responsible for access to the records. So in almost every federal and state agency, there'll be a name on the website. As I said, request it in writing. Don't explain precisely why you want the information. As a journalist, you should ask for a waiver of fees, that this is in the public interest. And as I said before, you need to expect delays and you need to consider legal action. Okay. When it comes to meetings, there is the open meetings law at the federal government level. It's called the Sunshine Act of 1976, and essentially it opens meeting of agencies covered by FOIA. Okay. There are exemptions when it comes to discussions concerning financial institutions and discussions concerning participation in civil legal matters. Also, if there is a personnel meeting going on, those are restricted as well. Now, when it comes to Pennsylvania, you can find the Sunshine Act of Pennsylvania quite similar in terms of what it does on the federal basis. You have a right as an individual and as a reporter to attend meetings. You also need to know what is considered a public meeting, so that a city council, for example, can't go behind closed doors and cut a deal. If they are discussing public policy, that needs to be out in the open, and you need to have a lot of people, particularly at smaller towns, don't know what the law is. So if you're covering things like that, you really have to go in with a copy of the law to make sure that they're standing up to what's required, not only at the federal level but also at the state level. So just a brief explanation of access to meetings and to documents. And so I want to thank my associate Sid, the Great Pyrenees, who decided to join me with some nice barks here. A shout out for everyone, or I guess a bark out. And we'll see you and hear you online. Thanks very much.